Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Tonight, before you drift into sleep, I want to take you somewhere unexpected. Not to a battlefield soaked in blood and glory. Not to a feast hall where mead flows and warriors boast, but to a place far quieter, far more intimate. A place where survival happened not through violence, but through discipline, through routine, through an understanding of the natural world that ran deeper than words. I want to take you to the deck of a longship. Picture it with me now. The North Sea stretches in every direction. Grey water meeting grey sky until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. The ship beneath you is narrow. So narrow that when you stretch your arms wide, you can nearly touch both sides. 70 feet long, perhaps, but only 9 feet across at its widest point. And into this sliver of oak wood, this ribbon of floating timber, 65 people have crowded themselves. 65 human beings, each with their own needs, their own fears, their own bodies that demand food, water, warmth, and yes, somewhere to relieve themselves when nature calls. There are no walls on this ship, no doors, no private spaces, no bathroom tucked away in a corner, no ceramic bowl, no running water, not even a simple hole cut into the deck with a seat built around it. Nothing. Just open space exposed to wind and wave and weather where every action is visible to every eye. And yet they survived. Not just survived, but thrived. These people crossed the North Sea again and again. They reached Iceland in 874, establishing farms on an island where volcanoes breathed fire and glaciers ground stone. They pushed further west to Greenland in 985, to shores where ice never fully melts. And then, around the year 1000, they touched the coast of North America, 500 years before Columbus. 5 centuries before the history books tell us Europeans discovered the New World. They did all this without succumbing to the diseases that would devastate ships for centuries afterward. No cholera outbreaks wiping out half the crew. No typhus spreading like wildfire through cramped quarters. No dysentery turning the journey into a floating nightmare of sickness and death. How that question has puzzled historians, archaeologists, and medical researchers for decades. Because here's the paradox that makes no sense. At first glance, the Vikings were famous for their cleanliness. Foreign visitors remarked on it with surprise and sometimes disgust. An Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling from the sophisticated cities of Baghdad, watched Vikings comb their hair every morning and bathe every week. An English chronicler named John of Wallingford complained centuries later that Danish Vikings seduced English women because they were too clean, too well groomed, too attractive compared to the local men. And yet, these fastidiously groomed people sailed on ships that had absolutely no sanitation facilities whatsoever. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, I want you to do something for me. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket a little higher. Feel the softness of your mattress beneath you. Notice how warm you are, how safe. How far removed from the cold, wet, exposed world of a Viking longship. The child within you, the part that still wonders about old stories and sometimes feels small in the darkness, needs to hear something tonight. You are loved. You are safe. You don't need to worry about tomorrow. Let yourself grow small and warm in the arms of memory. I'll keep talking steady and calm, and I'll be here beside you until morning comes. Now let's return to that ship. Let's understand how life kept going day after day, week after week, without the system collapsing into disease and death. Wood. Everything begins and ends with wood. Oak wood specifically. The kind that grows slowly in northern forests, dense and strong grain running straight and true. The Vikings possessed a spiritual connection to these trees. They didn't just see lumber, they saw the skeletal strength of their ancestors. Every knot in the wood told a story of a winter, survived a resilience that was transferred from the forest to the fleet. They chose pine for the masts, because it could dance with the gale, and ash for the oars, because it carried the flex of life itself, ensuring that even in the heart of a storm, the ship felt like a living creature beneath their feet. The Vikings possessed a spiritual connection to these trees. They didn't just see lumber, they saw the skeletal strength of their ancestors. Every knot in the wood told a story of a winter, survived a resilience that was transferred from the forest to the fleet. They chose pine for the masts, because it could dance with the gale, and ash for the oars, because it carried the flex of life itself, ensuring that even in the heart of a storm, the ship felt like a living creature beneath their feet. Beyond the sturdy oak for the hull, Vikings selected pine for towering masts that caught the wind like sails in a dream, and ash for oars that bent but never broke under strain. This careful selection ensured the ship could flex with the sea's moods, allowing minor leaks that refreshed the bilge naturally, a subtle design that kept the wooden world from becoming a breeding ground for unseen dangers. A Viking longship is not built like the ships you might imagine. It's not constructed from the keel-up ribs and planks fitted together like a skeleton and skin. No. Vikings build from the outside in. They start with a single long plank for the keel, then add strakes overlapping planks that climb upward in a technique called clinker building. Each plank overlaps the one below it, like scales on a fish, creating a hull that's both flexible and watertight. Well, mostly watertight. The Oseberg ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1904, shows us this construction in remarkable detail. Professor Gabriel Gustafsson spent months carefully removing blue clay from around the vessel clay that had preserved it for over 1,000 years. The ship measured just over 70 feet long and 16 feet wide. 15 pairs of oar holes pierced its sides, meaning 30 people could row at once. 30 rowers. But ships often carried more than rowers. They carried warriors, merchants, families, livestock, trade goods, food, water, and all the possessions people could fit into sea chests that doubled as rowing benches. Occasionally, the deck echoed with the bleats of sheep or the low moos of cows carried for fresh milk on longer voyages. Their waist, too, followed the same rules swiftly over the side, ensuring the ship's narrow confines remained as clean as the relentless sea allowed a harmony between man and beast in the face of the ocean's vast indifference. Think of the sensory overload, the smell of wet wool, the low grunt of a tired rower, and the metallic tang of salt-crusted iron. Amidst this, the presence of a few goats or a frightened sheep added a strange domestic layer to the maritime chaos. Their presence meant fresh milk, but it also meant a constant battle against filth, a battle won only through the relentless, unsentimental efficiency of the Viking crew. Imagine sitting on one of those chests. The wood is worn smooth by the bodies of previous rowers. It's damp from sea spray that never quite dries. Your chest contains everything you own in the world. A spare tunic if you're lucky, a cloak, your grooming tools because those matter as we'll see, maybe a small knife, perhaps a piece of jewelry or a good luck charm. That chest Is your seat during the day your pillow at night and your table when you eat? Feel the dampness of the wood beneath your palms and the slight vibration of the ship following the rhythm of the waves. It helps you visualize a life that was harsh yet resilient. This resilience is proven by modern replicas. In 1893, a replica of the Gokstad ship successfully crossed the Atlantic, proving these vessels were true ocean crossers. However, these modern voyages also highlighted a gritty reality hygiene. Real-life experience from these reenactments shows that crews must use the overboard method. Yet, despite the lack of facilities, illness is avoided because the open sea ensures the rapid dispersal of waste, preventing any dangerous accumulation. When Gabriel Gustafsson's team excavated the Oseberg ship, they found wooden buckets. One of them, nicknamed the Buddha bucket, was crafted from cypress wood and featured brass fittings with Eastern motifs. Being imported from the East, this bucket proves the existence of vast trade networks, adding a layer of historical wow factor to a simple utility item. As you run your fingers along the grain of your seat, you realize that your life depends on the person to your left and the person to your right. There is a profound, quiet intimacy in this lack of privacy. You see their strength, their exhaustion, and their commitment to the shared ritual of survival. This wasn't just a voyage. It was a communal meditation on the edge of the world, where the simple act of staying clean became a defiant statement of humanity against the vast indifferent blue. The deck around you is open to the sky. There's no cabin to retreat into when the weather turns ugly. No lower deck where you can escape the wind. When it rains, you get wet. When waves crash over the gunwale, you get soaked. When the sun finally breaks through the clouds, you can't find shade. You exist fully exposed to every mood of the North Sea. And the North Sea has many moods. Sometimes it lies flat and grey, like hammered pewter stretching endlessly in all directions, until you wonder if you've somehow sailed off the edge of the world. The ship glides across this stillness oars, dipping and rising in rhythm, creating small whirlpools that spin away behind you. On days like this, you can hear everything. The creak of wood flexing with each stroke, the splash of water, the breathing of the person rowing beside you, the call of seabirds following the ship hoping for scraps. These calm days carry their own peculiar tension. The silence amplifies every sound until your own heartbeat seems loud in your ears. You become aware of the vastness around you, the depth beneath the thin oak planks, the distance to any shore. Some men grow philosophical on such days, speaking quietly of gods and fate. Others grow restless, their warrior instincts unsettled by the lack of challenge. The younger ones might joke and tell stories to break the monotony, their voices carrying clearly across the still water. But always beneath the calm, there's an awareness. The sea is never truly tame. It's simply resting, gathering strength, deciding when to remind you who holds the real power out here. Other times, the sea rises up angry. Waves taller than a man chase each other across the water. The ship climbs each one like climbing a hill up and up until you're perched on the crest, looking down into a trough that seems impossibly deep. Then the ship tilts forward and you're sliding down into the valley between waves, water surging past the hull with a sound like tearing cloth. The ship shudders. Water sprays across the deck. You hold tight to your oar or your sea chest or whatever's nearest, and you pray to Thor or Christ or whatever God you believe might care about keeping you alive. In these conditions, every movement becomes an act of faith. You cannot walk across the deck without timing your steps to the ship's motion. You cannot eat without holding your bowl in both hands, protecting it from the next lurch. You cannot sleep without wedging yourself into a space where the roll won't throw you into the bilge water pooling at the bottom of the hull. And you certainly cannot manage basic bodily functions with any dignity at all. The human body doesn't care about storms. It doesn't wait for calm seas or convenient moments. When you need to empty your bladder or your bowels, you need to do it now, regardless of whether the ship is climbing a wave or the wind is driving rain horizontally across the deck. So, what do you do? The sagas don't tell us. These epic poems and prose narratives speak of battles and voyages, of discoveries and feuds, but they're oddly silent about the mundane realities of daily life aboard ship. They don't mention toilets, because as we'll discover, there weren't any to mention. They don't describe the awkward, uncomfortable, undignified process of managing waste in a space where privacy doesn't exist. But archaeology tells us things the sagas won't. When Gabriel Gustafsson's team excavated the Oseberg ship, they found wooden buckets. Beautiful buckets, actually. One of them, nicknamed the Buddha bucket for its brass fittings with Eastern design motifs, was carved from cypress wood and bound with decorative metal. These weren't cheap disposable containers. They were valuable objects, carefully crafted and maintained. The craftsmanship of these buckets suggests they were treated with a respect we rarely accord to sanitation tools today. They were symbols of an orderly life, a way to maintain a boundary between the wildness of the sea and the discipline of the crew. Each bucket was a testament to the Viking belief that even the most basic needs should be handled with a sense of purpose and care. They found similar buckets in the Gokstad ship excavated in 1880. That vessel, larger and more warlike than Oseberg, built around 890 AD for ocean crossing rather than coastal sailing, also contained wooden buckets of various sizes, some small enough to bail water, others large enough for other purposes. But here's what they didn't find. In either ship, any structure, any platform, any dedicated space for sanitation. No toilet, no latrine, no permanent facility of any kind. At first, archaeologists assumed these structures had simply rotted away. Wood decays. Maybe there had been some kind of seat or enclosure that simply didn't survive the centuries underground. But as more Viking ships were discovered and excavated, the pattern held. No toilets, no permanent sanitation facilities. Not in burial ships where the Vikings included everything they thought the dead would need in the afterlife. Not in working vessels like Gokstad that were clearly used for real voyages before being buried. Not even in the massive warships built later in the Viking Age, when shipbuilding had reached its peak of sophistication. The absence was consistent, deliberate, intentional. In 2020, a team of Norwegian archaeologists led by Lars Gustafsson used ground-penetrating radar to scan a burial mound at Gjellestad without disturbing the soil. The radar painted a picture of a Viking ship about 60 feet long, surrounded by a complex of buildings and graves. They could see the outline of the hull, the curve of the prow, even individual structural elements. And once again, no evidence of sanitation facilities. This tells us something important. The Vikings didn't simply forget to install toilets. They didn't lack the technology or the skill. These were people who could navigate across open ocean using the sun stars and wave patterns, who could forge pattern-welded swords with dozens of layers of steel. Who could carve intricate wooden sculptures that remain beautiful 1,000 years later? They chose not to have permanent sanitation facilities on their ships. That choice was as deliberate as their choice to make the ships shallow drafted and flexible rather than deep and rigid. As purposeful as their decision to make them open rather than enclosed. This philosophy of less is more allowed them to stay light, fast, and remarkably healthy. They recognized that a fixed toilet on a small boat was not a convenience, but a liability, a stagnant pool of danger in an environment that demanded constant movement and cleansing. But choices have consequences. And the consequence of having 65 people on a ship with no toilet should have been catastrophic disease. To understand why it wasn't, we need to look at what happened on ships that made different choices. There's a farm in Norway not far from the coast. The land rises and falls in gentle hills, grass growing thick in the short summer snow covering everything in the long winter. In the spring of 1903, a farmer was digging in one of these hills, probably looking to expand his cultivated land, or perhaps searching for stones to repair a wall. His spade struck something hard. Not stone, wood. He'd found a ship that had been deliberately buried, mounded over with earth and turf, and left undisturbed for over 1,000 years. Imagine his confusion, then wonder, then excitement. He calls to his family. They gather around the hole, peering down at the dark ancient timber emerging from the soil, like a secret the earth has kept for centuries. Word spreads through the valley. Neighbors arrive, drawn by curiosity. Everyone has heard stories of Viking burials of treasures hidden with the dead of ships that sailed not just across water, but into the afterlife itself. The farmer knows he's stumbled upon something extraordinary, though he can't yet understand how this discovery will change our understanding of an entire civilization. That night, he probably lies awake, listening to the wind, imagining the voices of those who sailed this vessel a millennium ago. Word reached Professor Gabriel Gustafsson at the University of Oslo. Gustafsson understood immediately what this might be. Viking ship burials were known, but few had survived intact. Most had been plundered centuries ago. But this one, hidden under its earthen mound, might still contain its treasures. The excavation began in the summer of 1904. It was painstaking work. The ship was fragile, its wood softened by centuries underground. The blue clay surrounding it had created an oxygen-free environment that prevented total decay, but the timber was delicate, requiring infinite care to expose and remove. What emerged was extraordinary. Not just a ship, but an entire world preserved in wood and metal and textile. The Oseberg ship, as it came to be called, was a carve, a type of vessel used for coastal sailing and ceremonial purposes. Its prow and stern rose high, carved with intricate interlacing designs that seemed to writhe and flow. Inside the burial chamber built into the ship's center, archaeologists found the remains of 2 women. The shadows cast by the setting sun against these carvings make the wooden dragons seem to breathe a visual echo of the spiritual power the Vikings invested in their craft. You can almost feel the presence of the 2 women buried within their spirits, tied to the vessel that carried them into the unknown. 2 women. Not warriors or kings as might be expected in such a rich burial. Women. One elderly, perhaps 80 years old at death. One younger, around 50. Their identities remain debated. Were they queens? Priestesses, high-status individuals, whose wealth and power matched any man's, we may never know with certainty. But we know what was buried with them. Sledges and a wagon, all elaborately carved. Textiles woven with complex patterns and dyed with expensive pigments. Kitchen equipment. Weaving tools. Beds with down mattresses. Barrels and buckets. Carved wooden posts that might have decorated a hall. Even the skeletons of 15 horses. 6 dogs and 2 cows, all sacrificed to accompany the women into death. In 2025, Swedish archaeologists unearthed treasures in a grave marking the shift from pagan rites to Christian influences, where hygiene tools blended with crosses, suggesting that as beliefs evolved, so did rituals of cleanliness, perhaps making shipboard life a bridge between old gods and new faiths. The preservation was so remarkable that textile fragments still showed their colours. Wood carvings retained their details. Metal objects emerged from the clay with their forms intact. And nowhere in all this wealth, in all these carefully selected grave goods, meant to equip the dead for whatever came next, was there any kind of toilet or permanent sanitation facility. As the Viking Ship Museum's 2026 hygiene exhibit reveals ongoing debates among scholars, including those at Roskilde, propose that women might have used sailcloth remnants as temporary screens supported by textile fragments from ship burials, though solid proof remains as elusive as a calm sea in winter. The ship itself tells the story. The hull is shallow, the draft minimal. It could sail in water barely 3 feet deep. The sides are low with barely 2 feet of freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck. This means waves can, and regularly do, wash directly across the deck. This low profile wasn't just about stealth or speed, it was a pact with the ocean. By staying close to the water, the Vikings allowed the sea to become their primary cleanser. Every splash of salt water was a natural scrub, a constant involuntary baptism that kept the wooden world from becoming a tomb of bacteria. The construction is masterful. Overlapping planks of oak, each carefully shaped to fit the curve of the hull, fastened together with iron rivets. The gaps between planks sealed with wool or animal hair soaked in tar, creating a waterproof barrier. Or rather, mostly waterproof. Some leaking is inevitable, even expected. But there's no below-deck space, no hidden compartments, no enclosed areas at all, except the burial chamber, built specifically for the women's bodies and grave goods, and that was constructed after the ship's working life ended specifically for burial. Ibn Fadlan's detailed disgust at the shared basin, where each Viking washed face hair and even snorted into the water before passing it on, contrasts sharply with the 5 daily ablutions of his own culture. Yet this communal ritual born of scarcity underscores the Vikings' pragmatic approach to staying clean in a world without flowing taps. When this ship sailed, and it did sail, it was completely open. Everyone and everything aboard was exposed to weather to spray, to the curious eyes of every other person on the ship. The Gokstad ship, found a quarter century earlier in 1880, told a similar story, but with different emphasis. This was a warship built for ocean crossings, longer than Oseberg at about 76 feet, slightly wider at 17 feet. 32 oar holes, meaning it could be rowed by 64 people. This ship had been tested. In 1893, a full-sized replica sailed from Norway to Newfoundland to prove Viking ships could cross the Atlantic. The journey took 28 days. The ship performed beautifully, handling North Atlantic weather with grace that surprised even experienced sailors. It proved beyond doubt that Viking vessels could make the journeys described in the sagas. But it also confirmed what the archaeological evidence suggested. There was nowhere private on the ship, nowhere enclosed, nowhere to install a permanent facility for managing human waste. Some scholars suggested that perhaps temporary structures were erected. Maybe screens of sailcloth for privacy. Maybe portable seats or boxes that could be set up and taken down as needed. Maybe different arrangements for men and women warriors, and slaves, free people, and thralls. But no evidence supports these theories. The ships were too small, too crowded, too exposed to rough weather for elaborate temporary structures. In a storm, anything not secured would wash overboard. Any screen would become a sail catching wind and causing chaos. The reality was much grittier and more honest. Privacy was a luxury the Vikings traded for survival. They lived in a state of radical transparency, where the health of the individual was the business of the entire crew. In this crowded wooden ribbon, there was no room for shame, only for the collective discipline that kept them moving forward through the freezing gale. The simplest explanation is usually correct. The Vikings sailed without permanent sanitation facilities because they had a better solution. Not better in comfort or dignity, but better in terms of health and survival. They understood something that would be forgotten for centuries afterward. Something that wouldn't be scientifically proven until the development of germ theory in the late 1800s. The best waste management system is one that doesn't let waste accumulate. But before we explore how they achieved this, we need to understand what happens when waste does accumulate. We need to see the horror that the Vikings somehow avoided. The year is 1854. Queen Victoria sits on the throne of the British Empire, which spans the globe. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Steam engines power factories and ships. Railways connect distant cities. Medicine is advancing. Science is uncovering the secrets of chemistry and physics. And in London, people are dying. Picture the streets of Soho in those terrible 10 days. Narrow lanes crowded with tenements, laundry hanging between buildings blocking what little sunlight reaches the cobblestones below. The air thick with coal smoke and the stench of open sewers. Families huddled in single rooms, sometimes a dozen people sharing a space no larger than a modern bedroom. When cholera strikes, it moves with terrible speed. A man feels fine at breakfast, complains of stomach pains by noon, and by evening his family is watching him convulse with cramps, his skin turning blue from dehydration, his voice reduced to a whisper. By morning, he's dead. The neighborhood doctor moves from house to house, powerless to help watching the same horror unfold again and again. Bodies pile up because there aren't enough carts to carry them away. The living huddle in their homes, terrified, praying they'll be spared, knowing prayer probably won't be enough. The cholera epidemic of 1854 killed over 600 people in just 10 days. It started in Soho, in a neighborhood around Broad Street. People began falling ill with violent symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea so severe it caused dehydration and death within hours. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. No one knew what caused it. The prevailing medical theory was miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad air through foul-smelling vapors that rose from rotting organic matter. So doctors recommended burning incense and avoiding the smell of sewage. Neither helped. A physician named John Snow had a different idea. He believed cholera spread through contaminated water, not air. He began mapping cases marking where people lived and died. A pattern emerged. Almost all the deaths clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street. Snow convinced local authorities to remove the pump handle, making it unusable. The outbreak ended almost immediately. Later investigation revealed the problem. A cesspit, a hole in the ground where human waste accumulated, had been dug too close to the well. Sewage had seeped through the soil and contaminated the drinking water. Everyone who drank from that pump was swallowing water contaminated with the bacteria that causes cholera. In Roman galleys, amphorae served as portable pots, dumped overboard in theory. But in the heat of battle or storm spills, fouled the decks, breeding dysentery that decimated crews, a fate the Vikings evaded through their open design and immediate dispersal. This was Victorian London, capital of the most powerful empire on earth, with modern engineering and medical science. And they were still dying from sewage contamination. The irony is profound. As humanity built higher and more complex systems, we inadvertently created more opportunities for our own waste to kill us. We forgot the ancient, brutal simplicity of the Viking deck, where nothing was hidden and nothing was allowed to fester. Now shift your attention to the sea. HMS Thunderer, a steam-powered warship launched that same year, 1854. This vessel represented the cutting edge of naval technology. Iron-hulled, steam-powered, armed with the latest artillery. It embodied humanity's triumph over nature through engineering. The crew lived below decks in sealed compartments. Hundreds of men crammed into spaces designed for efficiency, not comfort. Hammocks hung so close together you could touch your neighbor without stretching. The air was thick with sweat, coal smoke from the engines and the smell of unwashed bodies. The heads, as naval toilets were called, consisted of wooden seats positioned over holes that led directly to the sea. They were located at the bow of the ship, hence the name where the forward motion theoretically washed waste away from the hull. In practice, it didn't work that way. When the ship was stationary or moving slowly, waste accumulated around the bow. In rough seas, waves splashed back up through the holes, spraying contaminated water across anyone using the facility. Men developed sores and infections. Disease spread. The worst was below in the bilge. Water always finds its way into ships. Rain, spray, leaks in the hull, spills from drinking water barrels. It all ends up at the lowest point, the bilge, a dark, dank space beneath the lowest deck. In the enclosed compartments of a steam warship, this water became stagnant. It mixed with coal dust grease from machinery food scraps, and yes, human waste that found its way through cracks and gaps in the deck. The bilge bred disease. Sailors called it bilge fever. We now know it was typhus spread by lice that thrived in the filthy conditions. Men sickened, some died, others were left permanently weakened. In 2025, reenactments at Vikingskipsmuseet sailors layered linen against skin and wool atop but seawater rinses left clothes stiff as boards, a minor discomfort that echoed the Vikings' resilient adaptation to the elements without succumbing to the filth that plagued enclosed ships. The Viking diet, rich in 30 to 35% protein from smoked fish and dried meat, bolstered their resilience at sea, warding off the weaknesses that led to outbreaks in Victorian crews, where poor nutrition compounded waste-related woes. This was progress. This was modern naval engineering, and it killed more sailors through disease than enemy action ever did. Modern replicas provide a clear comparison. During reenactments by the Viking Museet, crews struggled immensely with privacy, yet they avoided the bilge fever of the 19th century through constant cleaning and the ship's open design. This stands in stark contrast to modern enclosed vessels, where mechanical failures can lead to rapid outbreaks. The tragedy of the Victorian sailor was one of confinement. They were trapped in a steel box with their own filth, a technological prison that the Vikings, in their open-air wisdom, would have viewed with absolute horror. The Viking ship breathed. The Victorian ship suffocated. Compare this to earlier sailing ships, the great wooden vessels that dominated European navies from the 1600s through the early 1800s. Ships of the line three-masted giants carrying hundreds of crew and massive gun batteries. These ships had somewhat better ventilation than steamships, with grates and hatches that allowed air circulation, but they still accumulated filth. Captains' logs and surgeons' reports from these vessels make grim reading. Scurvy ravaged crews on long voyages, killing men slowly through vitamin C deficiency. Typhus erupted regularly, spread by body lice and rat fleas. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water, turned ships into floating hospitals, where men lay in their own waste because they were too weak to move. One surgeon's report from a British naval vessel in 1780 described finding dead rats in the water barrels. The water had been rank for weeks, but men drank it anyway because there was nothing else. Half the crew fell ill. Dozens died before the ship limped into port. These were warships of major naval powers. They had professional crews, dedicated medical staff, and supply systems that kept them provisioned for months at sea. And still waste accumulation led to disease and death. Ancient navies faced similar problems. Roman galleys carried amphorae, large clay jars that served as portable toilets. When full, they were supposedly dumped overboard. But in battle or rough weather, men couldn't reach the jars. The deck became fouled. Disease followed. Chinese junks, which sailed vast distances across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, dealt with waste by designating specific areas of the ship for sanitation. But on long voyages, these areas became contaminated. Intestinal parasites spread through the crew. Historical records mention stomach sicknesses being common among sailors. The problem is universal. Put humans in a confined space. Let waste accumulate. Disease will follow. It's inevitable, predictable, scientific, or so it would seem. Because the Vikings sailed for 3 centuries across the North Atlantic without creating the kind of catastrophic outbreaks that plagued every navy that came after them. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and North America. They raided and traded from Russia to North Africa. And they did it on ships that were smaller, more crowded and more exposed than the vessels that would suffer so terribly from waste-related disease. How the answer lies in 3 simple principles that work together to create a system far more effective than the complex engineering that came later. The first principle: disperse immediately. Stand at the edge of a Viking longship, not in your imagination, but truly try to feel it. The ship rocks beneath your feet, a constant gentle motion that becomes part of your heartbeat after days at sea. The gunwale comes to about your waist, maybe a little higher, just enough to give you something to grip when the ship rolls. Below, the sea moves. Not dramatically, not in a storm, just the regular swell of the North Atlantic. Grey-green water rises and falls. Waves don't crash against the hull. They slide along it, making a susurrus sound like whispered secrets. Egil's saga whispers of warriors bathing in the sea before clashing blades not just for cleanliness, but to harness the water's invigorating chill, turning the ocean into a ritual bath that sharpened senses and steeled resolve against foes. 2025 excavations at beaching sites revealed herbal pouches likely carried by women for managing monthly cycles, blending nature's remedies with cloth absorbents to maintain dignity amid the waves' unyielding rhythm. The ship sits low, so low that when a larger wave passes, water washes directly across the deck. Not a flood, not enough to be dangerous, just a sheet of cold seawater that swirls around your feet before draining through gaps between the planks and out through the scuppers, the small holes cut in the gunwale to let water escape. This constant washing was the Vikings' greatest medical defense. They didn't have antibiotics, but they had the entire North Atlantic as their disinfectant. Every wave was a fresh start. Every gust of wind carried away the pathogens that would have settled in a more stagnant environment. You can feel the vitality in this design, a ship that doesn't fight the sea, but invites it to keep the crew alive. This is freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck. On a Viking longship, it measures perhaps 18 inches, 2 feet at most. Modern ships have freeboard measured in tens of feet. Cruise ships tower above the water. Aircraft carriers have flight decks so high above the sea that waves seem like distant ripples. But a Viking ship hugs the water. It sits in the sea more than on it. There's an intimacy in this closeness to the water that modern sailors rarely experience. You can trail your hand over the side and feel the ocean's pulse directly, no barrier between your skin and the ancient cold. Fish sometimes leap near the hull, close enough to touch. Seabirds land on the gunwale, regarding you with curious eyes before taking flight again. At night, if the water is calm and the sky clear, you might see phosphorescence, tiny organisms lighting up with each stroke of the oar, creating trails of cold green fire in the darkness. The Vikings called this sea fire, and some thought it was a blessing from the gods. In truth, it was just biology, but the wonder remains the same. This proximity meant you were never separate from the ocean. You were part of it, living on its surface like a water beetle skims across a pond. And this relationship, this constant contact, was key to their survival. This seems like a flaw, a weakness. A ship that sits so low must be vulnerable to swamping, to being overwhelmed by waves, to sinking in rough weather. And yet, they didn't sink. These ships sailed through North Atlantic storms and survived. They crossed from Norway to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to North America, and back again. For 300 years, they dominated the northern seas. The low freeboard wasn't a flaw. It was a feature, a deliberate design choice that solved multiple problems at once. Science now confirms what Vikings intuited: seawater's salt content acts as a mild antiseptic, slowing bacterial proliferation in wounds or waste, a hidden weapon that turned the ocean into an unwitting ally against infection. When you need to manage waste on a ship, the sea itself becomes your ally. Salt water is mildly antiseptic. The salt inhibits bacterial growth. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. And the sheer volume of the ocean creates dilution beyond comprehension. A bucket of waste dumped into the sea is instantly diluted by millions of gallons of water. The concentration of any pathogens drops to negligible levels within seconds. But this only works if you can actually reach the water easily. If accessing the sea requires climbing over high railings or using complex systems of ropes and pulleys, people will avoid it. They'll wait. They'll use containers and empty them later. Waste will accumulate. The Vikings eliminated that temptation. The water is right there, a few steps away, an arm's reach beyond the gunwale. You can trail your hand in it while you row. You can scoop it up in a bucket for washing. And yes, you can empty waste into it directly and immediately. The wooden buckets found in Viking ship burials served multiple purposes. Some held drinking water, others held food. But some undoubtedly served as emergency toilets when weather or circumstance made going to the rail impossible. The key was immediate disposal. Use the bucket, walk to the gunwale, empty it overboard, rinse it with seawater. Done. The entire process takes less than a minute. There's no accumulation, no storage, no breeding ground for bacteria. Imagine the quiet, grim determination of a sailor performing this task in the middle of a gale. There's no room for hesitation. You act with the speed of ritual, knowing that your haste is what keeps the person next to you from falling ill. It is a profound act of service hidden in a mundane chore. This required discipline, cultural agreement, social pressure. You couldn't be lazy about it. You couldn't let a used bucket sit for hours or days. That would endanger everyone. And the Vikings understood collective responsibility in a way that many modern people struggle with. On a longship, your actions affect everyone. There's no privacy, no way to pretend your behavior doesn't matter. Everyone sees everything. Social pressure enforces compliance. The sagas mention this indirectly. They speak of men being mocked for uncleanliness, for having lice, for smelling bad. This focus on hygiene is even rooted in literature. In Egil's saga, there are mentions of bathing before battle, implying that maintaining cleanliness, even at sea, was a tactic to preserve strength. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about being fit for war. These weren't just aesthetic complaints, they were survival mechanisms. Public shaming enforced the behaviors that kept everyone alive. But immediate disposal through the side of the ship only works when conditions allow it. During storms, when waves crash over the deck, and holding onto anything secure is a full-time job, you can't casually walk to the rail and lean over the side. That's suicide. For those times, buckets served as necessary containers. But even then, the low freeboard helped. The moment conditions improved slightly, the instant the ship crested a wave and had a few seconds of relatively calm water, someone could grab that bucket and empty it. The proximity of the sea meant waste never sat for long. Women and children posed special challenges. The historical record is frustratingly silent on specifics, but we know women travelled on these ships. The Oseberg ship burial contained 2 women of high status. The sagas mention women like Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, making multiple Atlantic crossings. Archaeological evidence from Lens or Meadows. The Viking settlement in Newfoundland includes spindle whorls and other items associated with women's work. These women would have faced the same lack of privacy as men, but with additional concerns related to menstruation and female bodily functions. How did they manage? Likely through a combination of timing improvisation and mutual understanding. Perhaps they developed a silent language of nods and turns a shared agreement of looking away that provided a psychological shield where no physical one existed. This vulnerability created a unique bond among the travelers, a recognition that they were all, regardless of status or gender, subject to the same biological truths, in the middle of a vast, unyielding ocean. Archaeology also sheds light on the women's experience. From the Oseberg grave, we find evidence that Viking women may have used specific herbs or absorbent cloth to manage menstruation at sea, based on findings from coastal beaching sites. Perhaps they used the buckets more than men did. Perhaps other women created informal barriers with their bodies turning their backs to provide minimal privacy. Perhaps they waited for dawn or dusk times, when most people were occupied with ship duties to attend to personal needs. We'll probably never know the exact methods, but we know they managed well enough that women continued to travel on these ships for 3 centuries. If conditions had been impossibly difficult, if the system hadn't worked, women would have stopped going. The fact that they continued suggests they found the situation tolerable, if not comfortable. The proximity to the sea solved another problem: cleaning. Keeping yourself clean in an environment without fresh water to spare requires creative solutions. But seawater, while not drinkable, is abundant. You can splash it on your face and hands. You can use it to rinse your clothes, even though the salt makes them stiff when they dry. You can wash eating utensils in it. You can pour it over the deck to wash away spills and dirt. The Vikings did all of this. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts mention regular washing with seawater. Not ideal, but better than no washing at all, and far better than living in accumulated filth. But even immediate dispersal into the sea has limits. Eventually, you need to stop, to rest, to replenish supplies, to tend to maintenance, to sleep on solid, unmoving ground. For that, the Vikings developed the second principle, the geography of reset. Morning breaks grey and soft over the North Sea. You've been rowing since before dawn, taking your turn at the oar, while others slept wedged between sea chests and coiled ropes. Your shoulders ache. Your hands, despite their calluses, hurt where the oar has rubbed them raw in new places. As feet meet sand, the air fills with the crackle of kindled fires and the earthy scent of damp soil, a sensory reset that washed away the sea's salty grip, offering brief solace in nature's embrace. Imagine the sensation of your feet finally touching damp sand, the sea breeze stroking your face, offering a moment of profound rest after the relentless motion of the North Atlantic. The shipmaster, standing near the stern with one hand on the steering oar, shouts a command. His voice carries easily across the open deck. He's spotted something the rest of you haven't yet seen. Land, a coastline emerging from the morning mist. This isn't your destination. This is just one of hundreds of stopping points that every Viking shipmaster knows by heart. A beach, probably, sandy or gravel, with the right slope for running a ship aground without damaging it, with fresh water nearby, with enough space for 65 people to stretch their legs and tend to business. The ship turns toward shore. The rowers adjust their rhythm. As the water shallows, you can see bottom now rocks and sand visible through the green water. 20 feet deep, 15, 10. The shipmaster judges it perfectly. At 5 feet, he gives the command to ship oars, pulling them inboard and laying them along the deck. The ship's momentum carries it forward. The keel, that single long timber forming the ship's spine, touches sand with a grinding sound that you feel more than hear. The ship slides up the beach, pushed by the last of its momentum and the waves behind it. Men jump over the sides, splashing through knee-deep water, hauling on ropes to pull the ship higher, beaching it so completely that the tide going out will leave it high and dry. Feel the sudden stillness. The The ship no longer rocks. You step onto the damp sand, and for a second your legs feel weak, unaccustomed to the lack of motion. This is the reset, a chance for the vessel to be scrubbed for the buckets, to be sanitized on the shore, and for the human cargo to breathe air that doesn't taste of salt and sweat. It is a moment of profound gratitude, a return to the earth that feels like a homecoming, even on a strange shore. The relief is immediate and profound. Your legs wobble as you step onto sand that doesn't move, solid earth that stays exactly where it is. For a moment, you feel drunk, your inner ear still expecting the deck to rise and fall beneath you. Others laugh at the sensation, grateful for this reminder that the world does indeed have stable ground. The first priority is always water, fresh water. Men scattered toward the stream the shipmaster spotted, carrying water skins and barrels. The taste of that first cold sweet drink after days of weak beer is almost painful in its goodness. Children, if there are any aboard, run up and down the beach, shrieking with delight at being able to move freely. Even the dogs, if the ship carries any race in circles, barking at seabirds. The adults move with purpose. Some gather driftwood for fires. Others scout the area for signs of danger or opportunity. The ship itself receives attention. Men inspect the hull for damage, repack tar into any gaps that have opened, check the rigging, bail out accumulated bilge water and scrub the interior with handfuls of sand and salt water. This is the genius of the shallow draft. A ship that draws only 3 feet of water can approach almost any coastline. Rivers, beaches, mud flats, places where deeper vessels would run aground and be stuck. The Vikings turned this limitation into an advantage. They didn't sail from port to port, spending weeks at sea between stops like later ships would. They island hopped. They followed coastlines. They stopped constantly, sometimes twice a day. Once in the afternoon to cook a hot meal, and once at night to sleep on dry land. This pattern of frequent beaching appears throughout the archaeological record. Between Norway and Newfoundland, researchers have identified over 200 Viking-age landing sites. Not permanent settlements, not towns or trading posts, just beaches and river mouths where ships could be run aground safely and crews could perform the necessary tasks of daily life. Some of these sites are tiny, just a scatter of fire-cracked stones marking where someone built a campfire. Maybe a few post holes suggesting a temporary shelter, a midden of animal bones and shells from a single meal. Others are enormous. The Viking. Great Army's winter camp at Torksey, England, covered 55 hectares. That's nearly 140 acres. A temporary city that housed thousands of warriors and support personnel during the winter of 872-873 AD. Furthermore, a 2024 study using numerical modelling at the Torksey winter camp shows that frequent beaching actually helped combat coastal erosion in some areas, though it caused localized pollution. This adds a layer of complex scientific value to their seasonal camps. Archaeological surveys using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar have revealed the camp's layout: rows of structures, central gathering areas, defensive perimeters, and yes, cesspits. Cesspits, holes dug into the ground for waste disposal. When you're camping with thousands of people for months, you can't just scatter and use the woods. You need organized sanitation. The Vikings dug pits at a safe distance from the camp downwind if possible, far from the river that supplied drinking water. These pits reveal fascinating information. Archaeologists can analyze the soil for parasites, for seeds and pollen that indicate diet, for chemical signatures that tell us what people ate and excreted. At Torksey, the cesspits contained high concentrations of intestinal parasite eggs, primarily roundworm and whipworm, the same parasites found in Viking Age cesspits across Scandinavia and the British Isles. This tells us the Vikings suffered from these parasites, but it also tells us something more interesting. The parasites were concentrated in specific locations, the cesspits, not scattered randomly across the camp. However, this reset had environmental impacts. At sites like Birka in Sweden, research shows that parasite levels peaked due to pollution from cesspits. The Vikings consciously moved the problem to the land to protect the ship, a move that parallels modern debates about cruise ship pollution in our oceans. This demonstrates controlled waste disposal. Even in a massive temporary military camp, the Vikings maintained hygiene discipline. They didn't just defecate anywhere. They used designated areas. This limited the spread of parasites and kept living areas relatively clean. Smaller stops required less organization. When a single ship beached for a few hours, crew members could scatter into the surrounding area for privacy. Dig individual cathals and bury waste, the same technique modern wilderness backpackers use. Simple, effective, and it leaves the ship completely reset. When the ship launches again, everything is clean. The deck has been washed with seawater while the ship was beached. Buckets have been thoroughly rinsed. Food has been cooked and eaten on land, so there are no scraps rotting in the bilge. The crew has bathed in a stream or the sea. Even clothes have been washed and spread on rocks to dry in the sun if the sun cooperates. The ship returns to the water essentially sanitized. Any build-up from the previous leg of the journey is gone. The cycle can start fresh. This constant cycle of movement and cleansing prevented the accumulation of rot that plagued static societies. The Vikings were maritime nomads, and their health depended on this refusal to settle into their own waste. They were always moving, always washing, always leaving the danger behind on the shore. This pattern of frequent stops had other advantages too. It allowed crews to supplement dried provisions with fresh food. Fish caught from shore, birds' eggs gathered from cliffs, wild plants, perhaps trade with local populations for bread meat or beer. It also meant crews could rest. Sleeping on solid ground, even if it's just wrapped in a cloak under the stars, is more restful than sleeping on a rocking ship. Men could dry their clothes completely, repair equipment, perform ship maintenance, and crucially, it provided natural breaks in the transmission of disease. If someone was sick, the rest of the crew could keep some distance during the stop. Infectious periods would pass. Symptoms would either improve or worsen to the point where the sick person had to be left behind. The geography of the Viking world made this beaching strategy viable. The coastlines they sailed from Norway through the North Sea to the Baltic, from Scotland through the Irish Sea and across the North Atlantic through Iceland and Greenland offered countless suitable beaches. Rocky shores gave way to sandy coves. River mouths provided sheltered anchorages. Islands dotted the sea, each one a potential stopping point. The Vikings learned these coastlines in extraordinary detail. Not just major landmarks, but minor ones. A particular pattern of rocks, a distinctive headland, the way waves broke over a submerged reef. This knowledge was memorized and passed down through oral tradition, encoded in poetry that served as navigational mnemonics. When you stop frequently enough, waste never builds up to dangerous levels. The ship stays clean through constant renewal rather than through complex sanitation systems. It's a different philosophy entirely. Not managing waste, but preventing its accumulation. But even with immediate dispersal and frequent resets, the system still needed one more element, something less tangible but equally important. A cultural framework that made the other two principles work consistently, day after day, voyage after voyage. The Vikings needed ritual. Saturday. We barely think about the word. It's just one of the 7 days, the last one of the work week in modern Western calendars, a day associated with errands and relaxation and whatever needs doing before Sunday. But the word itself carries memory. Saturday comes from the Old English Saturnisteg, meaning Saturn's day borrowed from Latin. The Germanic peoples had their own name. The Norse called it Laugardaga. Laugardaga. Washing day. The day for getting clean. This wasn't casual. It wasn't optional. It was woven into the structure of the week itself, as regular and necessary as the sunrise. Every 7 days you bathed. You heated water if you could. You washed your body, your hair, your clothes. You scraped your face with a sharp blade if you were a man who preferred to be clean-shaven. You combed tangles from your hair and beard. You cleaned under your nails. You tended to your body with the same care you'd give to a valuable tool. In the soft morning light of Logardago, the ship transformed from a machine of war into a sanctuary of self-care. The sight of warriors carefully braiding their hair or cleaning their ears with silver scoops is a beautiful, quiet contradiction to the violent image we have of them. This was their armor, not of iron, but of dignity. The Vikings were actually cleaner than many in the later Middle Ages. They manufactured soap using lye from wood ash and animal fat, and graves show evidence of soaps perfumed with local herbs. This wasn't just for health, it was a ritual of status, because that's what your body was, a tool for survival, and tools need maintenance. The ritual began early in the day. Water would be heated over a fire brought to steaming in wooden tubs or iron cauldrons depending on what was available. In a household, family members bathed in order of status. The head of household first, then their spouse, then children, then servants or slaves. The water grew progressively dirtier, yes, but everyone got a turn. On a ship, the ritual adapted. You couldn't heat large quantities of water without stopping to make camp on shore. So Logardaga might mean a more thorough seawater wash. It might mean taking advantage of a stop to find a stream and bathe properly. It might mean waiting for rain and using every drop to clean yourself as thoroughly as possible. What mattered wasn't the method. What mattered was the commitment. Every Saturday, without fail. No matter how tired you were, how cold the water, how busy the day, you washed. This commitment was enforced not by law, but by culture, by the weight of social expectation, by the scorn you'd face if you let yourself become noticeably dirty. We have two historical accounts of Viking hygiene practices, and they contradict each other in fascinating ways. Both are valuable, both are biased, and both tell us something true about Viking culture. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and scholar from Baghdad, encountered Vikings along the Volga River in 922 AD. He was traveling as part of a diplomatic mission from the Abbasid Caliphate to the Volga Bulgars. Along the way, he met a group of Rus Vikings, Swedish traders, who had travelled down through what is now Russia to trade furs and slaves for silver and silk. Ibn Fadlan was disgusted by them. He came from a culture where ritual purity was central to religious practice. Muslims performed ablutions 5 times a day before prayers. Public bathhouses were central to Islamic cities. Cleanliness wasn't just aesthetic, it was spiritually necessary. The Vikings, he observed, did something that horrified him. Each morning, a slave would bring a large wooden basin of water. The master would wash his hands and face, then dip his head to wet his hair. After wetting it, he'd run his fingers through it, then snort and spit into the water. All of this, his nose blowing, and saliva and the dirt washed from his skin, and hair went into the same basin. Then the basin was passed to the next person, and the next, and the next. Each person washing in the same water that previous users had contaminated. To Ibn Fadlan, this was barbaric. These people shared filthy water as if it were precious, too miserly or ignorant to provide fresh water for each person. He wrote about it with evident distaste, describing the Rus as the filthiest of Allah's creatures. But consider the context. These were traders on a river journey in a land far from home. Water might have been rationed, resources limited. What Ibn Fadlan saw as filthy habits might have been pragmatic responses to scarcity. The Vikings weren't at home. They weren't living in comfort. They were making do with what they had in difficult circumstances. Yet even in this barbaric ritual, there is a sense of community. To share water, even dirty water, was to acknowledge a shared biological fate. It was a messy human way of saying, "We are in this together." Now consider John of Wallingford, an English chronicler writing 3 centuries later, around 1220 AD. He was recording the history of his abbey and the surrounding region, including the period of Danish Viking settlement and conquest. Wallingford complained bitterly about the Danish Vikings, but not about their uncleanliness. Quite the opposite. He complained that they were too clean, that they bathed every Saturday, that they combed their hair daily, that they changed their clothes frequently and dressed well. Why did this bother Wallingford? Because he wrote with evident irritation, English women found these Danish men attractive. The Vikings were seducing English women by being cleaner and better groomed than English men. This is extraordinary. An English monk complaining that foreign raiders are too clean, that their hygiene is a social problem because it makes them sexually attractive to local women. This highlights a core truth about Viking culture. Their cleanliness was a source of power. It wasn't just about avoiding germs, it was about presence. A clean warrior was a disciplined warrior. A well-groomed man was a man who respected himself and his kin. This aura of order in a chaotic world was magnetic, a soft power that was just as effective as the edge of an axe. Both accounts are biased. Ibn Fadlan came from a sophisticated urban culture and looked down on barbarous northerners. Wallingford was trying to explain why his people had been conquered and why Viking descendants now formed part of English society, which required painting the invaders as somehow unfairly advantaged. But between them, they sketch a picture of a culture that valued cleanliness highly, at least by medieval standards. A culture where regular bathing was normal enough to be encoded in the name of a day of the week, where grooming tools were valuable enough to be buried with the dead. Archaeological evidence supports this. Viking graves across Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora contain grooming tools with remarkable frequency. Combs appear in nearly every grave that has preserved organic materials. These aren't crude implements. They're finely made objects carved from antler or bone, sometimes decorated with geometric patterns or animal designs, often kept in protective cases to prevent damage. The combs served practical purposes. They removed lice and their eggs from hair and beards. Lice were common in medieval Europe, where people lived in close quarters with limited washing. But lice weren't just annoying, they were dangerous. Body lice spread typhus, a bacterial infection that causes high fever delirium and often death. Regular combing combined with weekly bathing kept lice populations manageable. Not eliminated that would require modern pesticides, but controlled enough that they didn't cause epidemics. Other grooming tools served similar purposes. Tweezers for plucking unwanted hair, ear scoops for cleaning ears, nail cleaners, even something that appears to be a toothpick or dental tool based on wear patterns on Viking-age teeth that suggest regular cleaning. The Vikings also used soap. Not the harsh lye soap used for cleaning clothes, though they had that too, but gentler soap for washing skin and hair made from rendered animal fat, mixed with wood ash, and sometimes perfumed with herbs or honey. This wasn't vanity, or rather, it wasn't only vanity. Cleanliness had religious significance too. The Vikings believed that the way you looked in life would be the way you looked in death and the afterlife. If you wanted to enter Valhalla looking like a warrior worthy of feasting with gods, you needed to maintain yourself properly. This belief created a powerful motivation for hygiene that transcended mere comfort or health. It made cleanliness a spiritual practice. When a Viking looked into the dark reflecting pool of the North Sea, he wasn't just checking his reflection, he was checking his readiness for the divine. Hygiene was his silent prayer, a ritual that prepared the soul by purifying the vessel. This ritual extended to all genders. In the Laxdæla saga, female characters are described as being meticulous about grooming, proving that the ritual of Laugadaga was a universal cultural armor that bound the community together. On a longship where resources were limited and conditions harsh, these rituals became even more important. They created structure, predictability, a weekly rhythm that marked time and provided psychological comfort. No matter how difficult the voyage, every 7 days brought Laugadaga, a chance to feel human again, to tend to yourself with care and attention, and crucially, these rituals created peer pressure. If everyone else is bathing regularly and combing their hair and maintaining themselves, you can't easily opt out. Your uncleanliness would be immediately visible. You'd be mocked, shamed, perhaps even excluded from the social group. The sagas contain numerous examples of characters insulting each other's appearance or cleanliness. These insults aren't just color commentary. They reflect real social dynamics. In a culture where physical proximity was inescapable and survival depended on cooperation, cleanliness was a collective responsibility. Your body odor affected everyone. Your lice could spread to everyone. Your lack of hygiene was everyone's problem. So culture enforced compliance, not through written laws or formal punishment, but through the far more powerful mechanism of social disapproval. But grooming and bathing, as important as they were, still only addressed part of the challenge. They kept the crew clean. They controlled parasites. They maintained morale. They didn't directly address the waste management problem. For that, the Vikings needed one more element, something they didn't even know they had. An accident that saved thousands of lives without anyone understanding why. Water is treacherous. It looks clean, clear, harmless. You can see through it, so it must be pure right. That's what people thought for thousands of years. If water looked clear and tasted acceptable, it was safe to drink. They were wrong. Water carries invisible death. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, things too small to see that can sicken or kill you. The Vikings didn't know this. They wouldn't know it for another 1,000 years when microscopes revealed the invisible world of microorganisms. But they survived anyway, not through knowledge, but through culture, through traditions that worked even though no one understood why. The Vikings drank beer. Not strong beer that would get you drunk. Weak beer, barely alcoholic, more like liquid bread than an intoxicating beverage. And they drank it constantly. Why beer instead of water? The common explanation repeated in history books and documentaries is that people in medieval times knew water was unsafe and drank beer to avoid getting sick. This explanation is partly true and partly myth. Medieval people didn't have a scientific understanding of waterborne pathogens. They didn't know that beer was safer because the brewing process killed bacteria. They just knew from centuries of observation that people who drank beer tended to stay healthier than people who drank water from questionable sources. The brewing process itself is what made the difference. To make beer, you boil water. You add grain, usually barley, that's been malted and then crushed. The boiling kills bacteria. The fermentation that follows creates alcohol and lowers the pH, both of which inhibit bacterial growth. Even weak beer is safer than raw water. Imagine the brewing process on land before a voyage. Women usually tended the brewing. They'd fill large wooden vats with water from the cleanest source available. Build fires beneath until the water bubbled and steamed. The smell of cooking grain filled the air rich and comforting. Children played nearby, knowing that in a few days, when the fermentation was complete, there would be a sweet, yeasty drink that tasted better than plain water and made your stomach feel full. The brewing was women's magic, a transformation of ordinary ingredients into something that could sustain life across an ocean. They didn't understand the science, but they understood the importance. A ship that sailed without adequate beer was courting disaster. So they brewed and brewed, filling barrel after barrel, sealing them with wax and prayers, knowing that somewhere on the grey sea, men would open these barrels and drink and be kept alive by the work of women's hands. On a Viking ship, water barrels would be filled with weak beer before departure. As the voyage progressed and the beer supply dwindled, they might mix it with fresh water obtained from streams at landing sites. But even cutting the beer with water meant you were drinking something that had been boiled and fermented, making it safer than pure stream water. Close your eyes and imagine a Viking kitchen on the day before departure. Not the grand hall of a jarl, but an ordinary farmstead where a family prepares for their son's voyage. The mother has been brewing for days. Her hands are red from stirring, her back aches from lifting heavy vats, but she doesn't stop. She knows what waits out there on the water. She's heard the stories of ships that sailed without proper provisions, crews that sickened and died because someone grew careless with the preparation. She tastes the beer, checking the fermentation. Not too strong, or it will run out before the journey ends and leave the men with nothing but questionable water. Not too weak, or it won't keep properly. Just right. The perfect balance that comes from years of experience, from knowledge passed mother to daughter through generations. This isn't just cooking. It's life insurance measured in barrels. The science of what she's doing wouldn't be understood for another 1,000 years. But she knows the pattern. Boil the water until it bubbles violently. Let it cool just enough. Add the malted grain that's been prepared through careful germination and drying. Wait for the yeast, those invisible workers she's never seen, but trusts completely to transform the sweet liquid into something stable and safe. The bubbles that rise to the surface, the smell that changes from grain to something sharper and more complex, these are her guideposts. When the taste is right, when the smell is right, when the texture is right, she knows it's ready. Other women prepare the skyer, that cultured milk that seems almost alive. They add a spoonful from the last batch to fresh milk, a living culture maintained for years, sometimes decades, sometimes passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, like an inheritance. The milk transforms slowly, thickening, souring, in a controlled way that preserves rather than spoils. It's another form of women's magic, turning the perishable into the durable through knowledge and patience. They also drank sour milk. This wasn't spoiled milk in the modern sense. It was cultured milk, similar to yogurt or kefir. Fresh milk spoils quickly, especially in warm weather. The fats separate. It develops a foul smell. It becomes inedible within days. But if you let milk sour, deliberately controlling the fermentation with specific bacterial cultures, you get something entirely different. The bacteria, usually Lactobacillus species, convert lactose into lactic acid. This drops the pH, making the environment hostile to pathogenic bacteria. The result is thick, tangy, and stable for weeks. The Vikings called this skyer in Iceland, or various regional names elsewhere in Scandinavia. They made it by adding a small amount of already soured milk to fresh milk, inoculating it with the right bacteria, then letting it ferment at room temperature. The culture could be maintained indefinitely, passed down through generations. Modern analysis of samples from sunken Viking hulls shows that their bilges actually contained fewer harmful bacteria than much later ships. The natural, constant leaking and bailing served as a self-cleaning mechanism, a filter provided by the sea itself. Diet played a role too. Their staple skyer, which remains a famous Icelandic export today, provided essential probiotics. This nutritional edge kept their gut health resilient against the occasional contaminated swallow of water. This created another accidental layer of disease protection. Fermented milk products contain beneficial bacteria that compete with harmful ones. Modern research has shown that regular consumption of fermented foods supports digestive health and may help prevent intestinal infections. The Vikings didn't know any of this. They just knew that these foods kept well and that people who ate them stayed healthier. Then there was the bilge water. Bilge water is unpleasant. It accumulates at the lowest point of any ship, a mixture of seawater that's leaked in rainwater condensation, spilled drinking water, and anything else that finds its way below the deck. In enclosed ships with multiple decks, bilge water can become stagnant and foul-breeding bacteria, and creating the infamous bilge fever that plagued naval vessels well into the 19th century. But Viking ships leaked differently. They were built using the clinker method with overlapping planks. The gaps between planks were sealed with wool or animal hair soaked in tar, But this wasn't perfectly watertight. A small amount of seepage was normal, expected, designed in almost. This constant slow seepage meant bilge water never became stagnant. Fresh seawater trickled in continuously. Old bilge water was bailed out constantly, a tedious but necessary task, usually assigned to younger crew members or those of lower status. The bucket went down, came up full, was dumped over the side. Repeat, 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 for hours. This constant turnover prevented the kind of festering stagnation that occurred in the sealed bilges of later ships. The bilge might smell unpleasant, a combination of seawater, wet wood and tar, but it didn't become a breeding ground for disease. The rhythm of bailing was like the breath of the ship. In, out, old, new. By failing to be perfectly watertight, the longship achieved a state of constant renewal. It was a beautiful paradox. The flaw was the cure. Another accidental benefit came from food preservation methods. The Vikings carried dried fish and dried meat. These staples could last for months if kept reasonably dry. Dried fish, particularly cod, was a major trade good throughout the Viking world. It provided protein and kept almost indefinitely. They also carried hard bread baked and then dried until it had the texture of wood. This wasn't eaten as is. You'd soak it in water or beer to soften it, or dip it in stew. But it didn't spoil. Weevils might infest it eventually, but even then it remained edible if you weren't too squeamish about the added protein. Cheese, particularly hard-aged cheese, travelled well. Butter preserved in barrels. Dried peas and beans. Honey, which never spoils due to its low water content and acidic pH. Notice what's missing from this list: fresh meat, fresh vegetables, fresh anything. All the foods most likely to spoil and cause food poisoning were absent or consumed quickly at landing sites. This meant the Vikings avoided one of the major disease vectors on later ships' rotten food. When provisions spoil aboard ship, you either throw them overboard, wasting precious supplies, or you eat them anyway and risk sickness. The Vikings' reliance on preserved foods eliminated this gamble. The combination of all these factors created something remarkable. None of it was planned. None of it was based on scientific understanding. It was all cultural practice, tradition, and pragmatic observation. They boiled their drinking water by making it into beer. They ate fermented foods that supported digestive health. They maintained ship ventilation through constant bailing of bilge water. They avoided foods likely to spoil and cause illness. And they combined this with immediate waste disposal and frequent beaching for complete resets. The result was a system, not designed consciously, but evolved through centuries of trial and error. A system that worked so well, it enabled the expansion of Viking influence across 3 continents and lasted for 3 centuries. But it only worked because all the pieces fit together. Remove any one element and the system would degrade. Let waste accumulate by eliminating immediate disposal and disease follows. Stop beaching frequently and contamination builds up. Abandon cultural hygiene practices and parasites spread. Switch to different foods and lose the accidental protection of fermentation. The beauty of the system was its simplicity. No complex technology required. No specialized knowledge beyond what any experienced sailor knew. Just discipline, routine, and working with natural processes rather than trying to override them. This is the principle that remains relevant today. Not the specific methods, we have better technologies now, but the underlying philosophy. Sometimes The best solution isn't fighting a problem head-on with complex engineering. Sometimes it's working around the problem, preventing it from occurring rather than managing it after it appears. The Vikings understood this instinctively. They couldn't eliminate waste. They couldn't eliminate disease risk. But they could create a system where waste never accumulated to dangerous levels, where disease never had the opportunity to spread unchecked, where small, simple practices combined to create remarkable resilience. There is a deep peace in this realization. We don't always need more tools. We need better habits. We don't need to conquer our environment. We need to flow with it. As you prepare to close your eyes, let this ancient logic soothe you. The idea that order is not a destination, but a series of small, honest actions performed day after day. 3 centuries. From roughly 790 AD to 1100 AD, Vikings dominated the northern seas. They raided monasteries in England and Ireland. They founded Dublin. They settled Iceland and Greenland. They reached North America. They traded down the rivers of Russia to Byzantium and the Islamic world. They served as elite guards for the Byzantine emperor. They fought, traded, explored, and settled across a vast swath of the medieval world. And they did it all from ships that had no toilets. This isn't a trivial detail. It's not a curiosity to laugh about. It's central to understanding their success. Because the ships weren't separate from the culture. The ships were an expression of the culture. They embodied Viking values and assumptions about how to live and work. The design itself reflected a philosophy. Make it simple. Make it flexible. Make it work with natural forces rather than against them. Don't try to control everything. Accept limitations and work within them. The ships were too small to carry large crews comfortably, so the Vikings beached frequently. The ships sat low in the water, so they turned proximity to the sea into an advantage. The ships leaked, so they used constant bailing to keep the bilge fresh. Every limitation was turned into a feature. Every weakness was mitigated by cultural practice. This is architectural minimalism as survival strategy. By deliberately not including permanent sanitation facilities, the Vikings avoided the problems those facilities would create. No structures to maintain. No enclosed spaces to become contaminated. No accumulation points for waste and disease. Modern architects speak of form following function. The Viking longship takes this further. The form eliminates function, deliberately forcing behaviors that serve a higher purpose. Let me tell you about a specific voyage to illustrate how this system worked in practice. In the summer of 1982, a ship left Norway for Iceland carrying 32 people. We know about this voyage because one of the passengers later became involved in a legal dispute that was recorded in the saga literature, and the details of the journey were mentioned as context. The voyage took 12 days, which was typical for reasonable weather. During those 12 days, the ship beached 4 times. Not because of emergencies or damage, but because that was the pattern. Every 3rd day, roughly, they'd find a suitable shore and pull up. They'd dig latrines, cook hot food, wash themselves and their clothes in fresh water when available, salt water when not. Scrub the ship's deck with sand and seawater. Check the hull for damage. Rest on solid ground. During the days at sea between these stops, the crew maintained their routine. Morning grooming. Immediate disposal of waste over the side. Bailing the bilge every few hours. Drinking weak beer instead of water. Eating preserved foods that couldn't spoil. The monotony of the routine was itself a kind of meditation. The same actions repeated reliably created a rhythm that made the voyage bearable. None of them got sick. Not during the voyage, not in the weeks after arrival. This wasn't unusual. This was expected, because the system worked. Not perfectly, they still had their parasites, their minor infections, their aches and pains. But they avoided the catastrophic failures that would come to define sea travel in later centuries. They arrived in Iceland healthy enough to work to establish themselves in a new land. Contrast this with a Spanish galleon crossing the Atlantic in 1588, part of the famous Armada. That ship carried over 200 men in a space not much larger than a Viking longship. It had elaborate facilities, private cabins for officers, designated heads, a crew of surgeons and physicians, everything the Vikings lacked. And yet, before the ship ever engaged English forces, a third of the crew was dead or incapacitated by disease. Typhus spread through the crowded lower decks. Dysentery turned the facilities into sources of infection rather than sanitation. Scurvy weakened men until they could barely stand. The very complexity meant to make the voyage easier, instead, made it deadlier. Cultural discipline complemented this design. The Saturday washing, the daily grooming, the immediate disposal of waste, the shared responsibility for cleanliness. These weren't written laws. They were habits so deeply ingrained they became invisible. Just how things were done. Strategic seamanship completed the system. The constant beaching, the detailed knowledge of coastlines, the ability to navigate in open ocean using sun stars and wave patterns, the mental maps of every suitable landing site between Norway and North America. All three elements, architecture, culture, and seamanship, had to work together. None was sufficient alone, but together they created something greater than the sum of parts. Consider what it meant to live within this system. Not just to use it, but to internalize it so completely that it became second nature. A young man joining his first voyage would watch the older sailors, learning through observation and imitation. He'd see how they moved to the rail without hesitation when nature called. How they rinsed the buckets immediately, never leaving them to sit. How they participated in laugardaga without complaint, even when the water was freezing and their fingers were numb. He'd learn that your reputation on a ship wasn't built through grand gestures or heroic deeds, though those had their place. It was built through small, consistent actions performed correctly every single day. The warrior who could split a shield with his axe, but neglected his grooming, would earn contempt. The merchant who could negotiate the best prices, but let his area of the deck become filthy, would find himself socially isolated. Competence in battle or trade mattered, yes, but competence in the daily rituals of hygiene and waste management mattered more, because your survival depended on everyone doing these things correctly. This created a fascinating social dynamic. The longship was perhaps one of the most egalitarian spaces in Viking society. A jarl might command, but he still used the same bucket as his thralls. A wealthy merchant might own cargo worth fortunes, but he still bathed on Saturday in the same water system as everyone else. The ship enforced a physical equality that land-based social hierarchies couldn't override. And this equality served a purpose beyond fairness. It meant everyone had skin in the game. Everyone's health depended on everyone else's discipline. You couldn't delegate hygiene to servants or slaves and assume you'd be safe. Your fate was intertwined with every other person on that narrow deck. This bred a kind of solidarity that transcended social class. On land, you might be master and servant wealthy, and poor free and enslaved. On the ship, you were all just humans trying to stay alive together. Environmental layers also dictated their survival. In Greenland, studies published in PNAS 2023 show that while rising sea levels up to 3.3 meters from 985-1450 AD eventually forced them out. The disciplined sanitation systems were what allowed them to endure such harsh conditions initially. Even in modern times, Viking ship replicas face disasters such as a sinking in Norway in 2024. Yet, interestingly, hygiene-related illness is never the primary struggle in these recreations, reaffirming that the Viking system is incredibly sustainable compared to complex mechanical ones. Compare this to what came later. Spanish galleons sailing to the New World in the 1500s lost more men to disease than combat. Scurvy ravaged crews on long voyages. Typhus erupted in the crowded, filthy conditions below deck. The famous Spanish Armada that attacked England in 1588 was already weakened by disease before it ever engaged the English fleet. British naval vessels in the 1700s and 1800s faced constant health crises. The Royal Navy discovered that lemon juice prevented scurvy, but the knowledge was later lost and had to be rediscovered. Typhus and dysentery remained common. Ship's surgeons kept detailed logs of symptoms and deaths, but had little ability to prevent disease. Even into the 1900s, naval vessels struggled with sanitation. The transition from sail to steam created new problems. Enclosed engine rooms, coal dust, heat, men working in conditions that would be considered inhumane today. The Vikings, with their primitive open boats and no sanitation facilities, somehow avoided the worst of these problems. Not through superior medicine or technology, but through a system that prevented problems from developing. This has implications beyond history, beyond maritime archaeology. It suggests something important about how we approach complex problems. We tend to seek technological solutions, build better systems, install more equipment, add more features and capabilities, more. And sometimes this works. Sometimes more complex systems are genuinely better. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes adding complexity creates new failure modes, new maintenance requirements, new ways for things to go wrong. The Viking approach was different. Subtract rather than add, simplify rather than complicate, work with natural processes rather than trying to override them. Modern naval vessels have elaborate sewage treatment systems. They work well when they're maintained properly, when nothing breaks when the crew operates them correctly. But they require constant attention, specialized training, spare parts, energy to run pumps and treatment processes. A Viking ship required none of that. Just discipline, just routine, just the sea itself, doing what the sea does naturally, diluting and dispersing and carrying away. This principle applies beyond waste management. It applies to any situation where accumulation creates problems. Financial debt accumulates when you spend more than you earn. The solution isn't necessarily earning more, though that helps. Sometimes the solution is spending less, preventing debt rather than managing it. Clutter accumulates in homes when acquisition exceeds disposal. The solution isn't bigger storage systems, it's acquiring less, or getting rid of things immediately rather than letting them pile up. Stress accumulates when responsibilities exceed capacity. The solution isn't necessarily working harder or faster. Sometimes it's saying no. Preventing overcommitment rather than trying to manage an impossible workload. The Vikings teach us that the best system for managing a problem might be a system that prevents the problem from occurring. That elimination is sometimes better than management. That working around constraints can be more effective than trying to overcome them through brute force. They crossed the Atlantic in open boats. They established settlements in Iceland and Greenland. They reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. And they did it without toilets, without antibiotics, without modern medicine. They did it through a system. A simple, elegant, robust system that worked because all its pieces supported each other. And because the people who used it understood at some deep level that survival wasn't about controlling nature. It was about working within nature's rules. The ships have rotted away. The Vikings themselves have been dead for 1,000 years. But the principles remain, valid, applicable, waiting for us to rediscover them. The ghostly echo of their oars still pulses through history, reminding us that we don't need a grand machine to cross a great distance. We only need the discipline to keep our decks clean and our spirits clear. The year is 1960. The nuclear submarine USS Triton completes the first submerged circumnavigation of Earth. 84 days underwater without surfacing. The crew lives in a sealed metal tube, breathing recycled air, drinking desalinated water, never seeing the sun. One of the many challenges the engineers had to solve waste management for 183 men in a completely closed environment. The solution required sophisticated chemistry. Waste had to be collected, ground up, sterilized, and either stored in tanks or discharged through a complex system of valves and pressure locks. The process was carefully designed, thoroughly tested, and required constant monitoring to ensure nothing went wrong. It worked. The mission succeeded. But the complexity was staggering, and the fundamental principle underlying all that sophisticated engineering, the same principle the Vikings understood without any scientific knowledge whatsoever. Don't let waste accumulate. Space stations face similar challenges. Astronauts living in zero gravity, where nothing falls down and nothing drains, naturally have to manage waste with meticulous care. Every bodily function requires specialized equipment, suction systems to handle urine, careful containment and sealing of solid waste, constant monitoring to ensure nothing contaminates the air or water. The technology is vastly different from anything the Vikings had. But the logic is identical. Immediate disposal, no accumulation, constant vigilance. Even the most advanced technology mirrors this. Modern submarines like the USS Triton and the International Space Station ISS operate on a no accumulation principle similar to the Vikings, though theirs is managed by vacuum pumps rather than buckets. Comparing a longship to the ISS honors the sheer brilliance of Viking simplicity. Modern cruise ships carrying thousands of passengers use elaborate sewage treatment plants. They process waste, treat it chemically and biologically, and discharge it into the ocean only after it meets strict environmental standards. The systems are complex, expensive, and require trained technicians to maintain. But the ocean is still the ultimate receiving body. After all the technology, after all the processing, the waste still goes into the sea, just like the Vikings did 1,000 years ago. The difference is scale and sophistication, not fundamental principle. This pattern repeats across human history and across cultures. Polynesian voyagers who settled the Pacific Islands, Arab sailors who mastered the monsoon trade routes, Chinese junks that sailed from Java to East Africa. Every maritime culture that succeeded had to solve the same problem. Most arrived at similar solutions: small, flexible vessels that could beach easily, frequent stops, cultural practices that emphasized cleanliness, working with the sea rather than trying to dominate it. The Vikings weren't unique in understanding these principles, but they applied them with remarkable consistency across 3 centuries and thousands of miles of ocean. And they did so in some of the harshest maritime environments on Earth. The North Atlantic isn't kind to small vessels, but the Vikings made it work. What made them successful wasn't brilliance, it wasn't innovation, it wasn't discovering some secret that others didn't know. It was consistency, doing simple things correctly every time without fail, following routines even when they were unpleasant, maintaining discipline even when you were tired and cold and wanted nothing more than to sleep. This is a lesson we struggle with in the modern world. We're fascinated by innovation, by new technologies and novel approaches, by disrupting established methods and finding revolutionary solutions. Sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes innovation is exactly what's needed. But sometimes the old ways work better than we give them credit for. Sometimes the simple solution applied consistently outperforms the complex solution applied sporadically. Think about your own life. What problems are you trying to solve with complexity when simplicity would work better? What systems are you building when prevention would be more effective? The Vikings couldn't prevent all disease. They still suffered from intestinal parasites. They still faced infections from wounds. They still dealt with scurvy on very long voyages. But they prevented the catastrophic outbreaks that would devastate later ships. They kept themselves functional, healthy enough to row, to fight, to trade, to establish settlements in new lands. That was enough. Not perfection, but sufficiency. Not zero problems, but manageable problems. Not invulnerability, but resilience. This is perhaps the deepest lesson the Vikings offer. Success doesn't require perfection. It requires being good enough consistently over time. It requires building systems that can survive imperfection rather than systems that demand perfection to function. A modern sewage treatment system that requires perfect maintenance and operation is fragile. A system based on immediate disposal and frequent resets is robust. It can tolerate human error, equipment failure, and difficult conditions. It keeps working even when everything isn't optimal. The Vikings built their entire maritime culture on this robustness. Their ships were forgiving. Their cultural practices were simple enough to maintain under stress. Their navigation methods worked without precision instruments, and so they succeeded. Not through brilliance, but through steady, consistent application of simple principles. When you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of longships cutting through grey water, of distant shores where no European has walked before, of people who were fundamentally like you and me, dealing with the same biological needs and challenges, finding ways to cope and survive, and even thrive in difficult circumstances. Or perhaps you'll simply rest, which is perfectly fine too. The story will be here tomorrow and the next day as many times as you need to hear it. But before sleep takes you completely, consider this. The Vikings teach us that wisdom isn't always about knowing more or having better tools. Sometimes it's about understanding what you can do without, what you can eliminate rather than add, how to work with constraints rather than fighting them. They crossed oceans without toilets. They stayed healthy without modern medicine. They navigated without GPS or charts. They did it through discipline, routine, and a deep understanding of natural processes. Those principles still work. Today, tomorrow, 1,000 years from now. As you lie in your bed tonight, comfortable and warm, I want you to think about what the Vikings would recognize in your life and what would baffle them. They'd understand discipline, the getting up at the same time each day, the routines you follow, the habits you maintain. They'd nod in recognition at the idea that consistency matters more than intensity, that small actions performed reliably create large results over time. But they might be puzzled by how we've externalized so many responsibilities. We've built systems to handle our waste, our food preservation, our hygiene. We've delegated these fundamental tasks to infrastructure and technology. And in doing so, we've created vulnerabilities they never had. When the system breaks down, when the technology fails, when the infrastructure stops working, many of us don't know how to manage these basic necessities ourselves. The Vikings couldn't outsource survival. They had to understand it, embody it, practice it every single day. And there's a kind of security in that. Not comfort, certainly. Not convenience, but security. The knowledge that your survival doesn't depend on complex systems you don't control and can't repair. That you have the skills and discipline to keep yourself alive with nothing but basic tools and natural processes. This isn't a call to abandon modern conveniences. That would be foolish. But perhaps there's wisdom in understanding the principles behind them. In knowing that beneath all our technology and infrastructure, there are simple patterns that have kept humans alive for thousands of years. Immediate disposal rather than accumulation. Frequent resets rather than persistent contamination. Cultural discipline rather than technological control. These principles apply to more than physical waste. They apply to mental clutter, to emotional baggage, to the accumulation of stress and worry that we allow to build up in our minds. The Viking approach suggests a different way. Deal with things immediately. Reset frequently. Maintain discipline through cultural practice and social support, rather than waiting for some external system to fix things for you. The technology will change. The specific methods will evolve. But the underlying truth remains constant. The best solution is often the simplest one. The best system is often the one that prevents problems rather than managing them. The best way forward is often to eliminate what doesn't work, rather than adding more of what might. We've traveled far tonight, you and I. From the North Sea to North America, from the burial mounds of Norway to the London cholera epidemic, from Viking Age Iceland to modern nuclear submarines. We've explored a question that seemed simple at first, but revealed layers of complexity and wisdom. How did Vikings manage waste on longships without getting sick? The answer, as we've discovered, isn't simple. It's not one technique or one clever solution. It's a system. A way of thinking about problems that emphasizes prevention over management, simplicity over complexity, and working with natural processes rather than against them. They dispersed waste immediately rather than storing it. They beached frequently to reset hygiene completely. They maintained cultural practices that controlled parasites and disease. They drank fermented beverages that were safer than water. They ate preserved foods that couldn't spoil. They built ships that turned limitations into advantages. No single element would have been sufficient, but together they created something remarkable. A maritime culture that dominated the northern seas for 300 years, using ships that modern people would consider impossibly primitive. This should give us pause, make us question our assumptions about progress and technology, make us wonder whether our complex solutions are always superior to simpler ones. If you are listening to this, take a deep breath. Imagine yourself as a Viking conquering the vast ocean, and share your thoughts in the comments about which lesson from their life you can apply to your modern world. I'm not suggesting we abandon modern sanitation or return to medieval hygiene practices. We have better tools now, better understanding, better methods for preventing disease. But the Viking approach contains wisdom we've partly lost. The understanding that elimination can be better than management, that prevention can be more effective than treatment, that simple systems consistently applied can outperform complex systems that require perfect conditions to function. If you're lying in bed right now, comfortable and warm, take a moment to appreciate what you have. Clean water at the turn of a tap. Sewage systems that work invisibly in the background. Medical care that would seem like magic to a Viking. But also recognize what they had that we sometimes lack. The discipline to do unpleasant tasks immediately rather than putting them off. The cultural cohesion that made everyone responsible for collective well-being. The intimate connection with natural processes that comes from depending on them for survival. We can learn from both, take the best of ancient wisdom and combine it with modern knowledge. Build systems that are both sophisticated and robust. Create solutions that are elegant in their simplicity but powerful in their effect. The Vikings would have been amazed by our world, the technology, the comfort, the sheer abundance of resources. But I suspect they would also find some things puzzling. Why we tolerate accumulation of problems we could prevent. Why we build fragile systems that require constant maintenance. Why we fight against natural processes instead of working with them. As we look forward, the 2026 conservation project at the Viking Ship Museum will feature a new exhibition specifically on Viking hygiene, bringing these ancient secrets into the light of the present day. Perhaps that's the real lesson of tonight's journey. Not just about Viking ships and waste management, but about how we approach any challenge. Look for what can be eliminated before adding more. Prevent accumulation before it becomes a problem. Work with constraints rather than always trying to overcome them. These are simple principles. But simple doesn't mean easy. The Vikings maintained their system through constant discipline, year after year, generation after generation. That's harder than building a complex machine. It requires cultural transmission of values and practices. It requires everyone participating consistently. But it works. It worked for them for 3 centuries, and it can work for us in different forms for whatever challenges we face. As you drift into sleep, let go of today's concerns. Tomorrow will come whether you worry about it or not. For now, you're safe, warm, resting in comfort that would astound people from most of human history. Let the history of these sailors be your lullaby, a story of how small, disciplined steps lead across entire oceans. You are part of that same lineage of survival, of finding order in the chaos, and of finding rest after the long row. And maybe in your dreams, you'll find yourself on a longship, feeling the roll of the waves, hearing the splash of oars, smelling salt and tar and wool, experiencing what it meant to travel in a world where survival required constant attention but also offered the satisfaction of meeting challenges directly. Thank you for joining me tonight, for listening to this story, for following me through all these twists and turns of history and archaeology and human ingenuity. I hope you sleep well. I hope you wake refreshed. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another journey through the past, another exploration of how people lived and survived and found solutions to their challenges. The Vikings are long gone. Their ships have rotted to fragments. But the principles they embodied continue, waiting for us to notice them, waiting to teach us, waiting to remind us that sometimes the old ways were wise ways. Until next time, rest easy, dream well, and remember that you're part of a long human story of adaptation, survival, and finding ways forward through difficulty. Good night.